Okay. Good afternoon. Muy buenas tardes. Bonjour. I'm Iracema Coronado, and I'm the Executive Director of the Commission for Environmental Cooperation of North America, and I want to welcome all of you here. We want to welcome you to the first series of lively discussions with environmental leaders from across North America that we will call CECTalks. We will be featuring interactive online discussions to talk about CEC's projects that bring together government, academia, industry, and civil society to develop innovative North American solutions to global environmental challenges. Upcoming CECTalks will focus on environmental innovations in North America's automotive industry supply chain and the growing e-waste recycling and refurbishing industry. Today, I would like to welcome two special guests who will be talking about the challenges North America's marine protected areas face as our climate changes. They will also be talking about how MPA managers and planners can address these challenges. Maria Brown is the superintendent of the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, a 1,255 square mile sanctuary that is located northwest of San Francisco Bay. She has received numerous honors, including an Environmental Hero Award from NOAA and a Certificate of Special Congressional Recognition for protecting the California coastline. Juliet Alperin has covered the environment for the National Desk of the Washington Post since April 2004. In pursuit of these stories, she has gone scuba diving with the sharks in the Bahamas, trekking on the Arctic tundra, and searching on her hands and knees for rare insects in the caves of Tennessee. Her most recent book is Demon Fish, Travels Through the Hidden World of Sharks. Thank you for joining us. Juliet, over to you.
Thanks so much, and we're okay, so you can hold over. Thank you so much, Iracema. We were excited to be here at the Commission to talk about some of these issues, so we're just going to start it off. Maria, I thought we could talk about right now, when we talk about climate change and its impacts on marine protected areas, what are the primary impacts that we're talking about that you're both seeing now and obviously are projecting to see in the future?
Well, we are seeing impacts now already. So climate change is here. We're seeing extreme weather events. Over the past 10 years, we've seen heat waves that have caused birds, cormorants that are black. They overheat when they're on their roosting sites, and they've actually died from heat exposure. We've seen Cassin's auklets, a small seabird that nests in rocky crevices in which we had built nesting boxes to create more habitat. We've seen them actually cook in their nesting boxes as if they are ovens, and had to redesign nesting boxes to allow for the air to go through their homes and cool them off. And that's from the heat waves. We've seen ocean temperatures get warmer, more frequent El Nino events. And with the warmer ocean temperatures, we've seen the migration of new species to our area. One of those species is the Humboldt squid. It is a voracious eater. It likes to eat juvenile rockfish, which is a commercially valuable fish in our region. And it's caused some concern. How is this going to impact our ecosystem? How is this going to impact our commercial fisheries? We've also seen bottlenose dolphins now come to our area. They came during the one of the El Ninos, and then started to set up residency. And in some ways, people see this as very exciting, having a bottlenose dolphin population there that you can see from shore. However, we're not sure what the impacts are of this new species to our area. We've seen potential interactions with the local harbor porpoise population, in which we may be seeing aggressive behavior from the bottlenose dolphins to the harbor porpoises. The harbor porpoises are being rammed by bottlenose dolphins, and we're not quite sure why. Some other things that we're expecting to see, but it's so soon in our monitoring that we can't determine the change yet, but a change in ocean currents. Upwelling is extremely important on the Pacific coast. It's one of the 4 major upwelling zones in the world. And we're seeing a change. Right now, we're not sure if it's a long-term change, if it's just an anomaly, but we're seeing stronger upwelling. And we're not sure, could this be good or could it be bad? With stronger upwelling, we're seeing stronger winds, and you see more mixing of the water and less relaxation periods. And what does that mean is that during those relaxation periods is when you see the large plankton blooms and just the life explode in that area of the ocean. But when there's lots of mixing, you don't get the relaxation, so you don't get the large plankton blooms. So you actually are seeing less productivity in the ocean during those strong upwelling seasons. There's concerns on the east coast of North America regarding currents and potentially the currents, warm currents going further up the North Atlantic, bringing warmer waters, and with that potentially warm water species which aren't native to the area. And I guess another impact is ocean acidification, and that's from increasing CO2 in our atmosphere. The ocean is a buffer and absorbs that CO2, but there comes a point where the ocean is going to be saturated, and with increasing CO2 in the ocean and increased acidity of the ocean, we're already seeing weakening of shells of calcium-forming organisms. And what does this mean to our ecosystems? We're still learning. There's concern for the commercial shellfish harvesting industry. In my area, we've seen an impact to the oyster farms. They get their spat from the Northwest, and it just hasn't been as productive, and they haven't been able to get the spat, the small microscopic oysters to grow on the shells. It hasn't been available, and so we're now looking in our region of how to farm that locally, so we can continue to have an oyster commercial fishery in our area.
So if those are, so those are some of the manifestations that you're seeing and obviously expect to intensify. When you look at right now what you're doing to address some of these challenges, what are kind of the immediate near-term steps, policy, research, et cetera, that you're doing that you think is preparing the sanctuary to cope with these changes?
Well, the first thing we did is we developed a climate impacts report that documents what the observed and predicted impacts are going to be for our region. And it's very similar to a guide that the Commission for Environmental Cooperation put out, a scientific guide on climate impacts for the Atlantic. And a lot of the observed and predicted impacts are very similar for both coasts. That gave us a foundation, a groundwork of where to start, because at times dealing with climate change, the thought of climate change can be so overwhelming. Just where do you start? So that gave us a starting point, and from there a group of experts helped put that report together, and they recommended next steps for us, and we're starting to move on to those next steps. One of those is identifying climate change indicators, identifying in our area what species, habitat, and oceanic processes are critical for our marine protected areas. And so we've brought together a group of experts to outline what those climate change indicators are for our region. And our next step now is to bring those experts together with managers and figure out what, which of these species, habitats, ecosystem roles that marine protected areas can help address in terms of climate change, and how can we address those areas in order to create more resilient habitats and species. So hopefully we can buy time for species to adjust.
And so obviously then looking forward and looking a little more long term, I mean, this, your sanctuary alone, at times supports 400,000 breeding seabirds, has 36 different marine mammals. When you look over a longer time horizon, when climate change is obviously going to intensify, what do you think is necessary, and how do you also respond differently when you have, for example, different species who are going to have very different responses to some of the things that are going on?
Well, there's going to be winners and losers. Some species will do better in the changing climate conditions, and others will do worse. And it's a hard question of where do you focus your efforts. Right now, we're looking at focusing our efforts on reducing the overall stressors to the environment, because if we can reduce the stress that's on these habitats and species right now, we can help buy time, hopefully, for species to adapt. Luckily, a lot of species can adapt, are adaptable. That's, you know, evolution. And for those that can, by that time. And the stressors in particular we're looking at addressing are, and I think they're probably common to most marine protected areas worldwide, are looking at pollution. How are we going to reduce pollution in the marine protected area? Pollution causes lower resilience in species. They're more susceptible to disease. And that's one thing we're concerned about with climate change, increasing diseases in our environment. Looking at overfishing. Are there impacts to their food sources? Can we address this through fishing practices, through harvesting? We're also looking at wildlife disturbance. And one thing we've done already is we've worked with the state of California to establish they're called special closures, or no access areas around breeding seabird colonies and roosting sites. And so we have 7 of these within the marine protected area I manage. And that it allows a safe haven for seabirds to go, to roost, to nest, in which disturbance is minimized from humans. Since you can't approach it by a boat, you can't access the island. It allows them to, you know, their young to have a higher survival rate, basically. And then, let's see, we have pollution, overfishing, wildlife disturbance, and I know there's another one we work on. It's not coming to me now.
While we're looking at that, I'm trying to think of what the other one. I'll look and see if I have my notes. But moving on, I was wondering. Obviously, the sanctuary is in the midst of a proposed expansion, and I was wondering if you could give us a sense of both how does widening the borders of the sanctuary help address some of these issues, and what might be the limitations when, again, these 3 countries are looking at the ability that they could, for example, extend existing protected areas in order to kind of create stronger networks for these species.
One of the things, and it's actually come from a grassroots effort from the communities in our area, have wanted us to expand the sanctuary, to actually significantly expand it. Right now we're approximately 1,200 square miles, and they'd like us to expand to another 2,700 square miles further north. And there's different reasons for doing it. There's political reasons and scientific reasons. The scientific reasons behind the expansion is to protect a whole system. And like I was mentioning earlier, is that we're looking at what are the critical systems that we need to protect in order to create a more resilient marine protected area in light of climate change. So the system we're looking at protecting is the upwelling system. The waters are generated further north, the strong upwelled waters that then travel down the coast bringing nutrients, which then during the warmer months bloom, and we get that high productivity. So it's expanding to protect that whole system. Along with that comes the idea of having these offshore rocks, which are important for the pinnipeds, the seals and sea lions to haul out on as breeding, not as breeding grounds, but as birthing grounds, and the seabirds, is that now we have continuity between these sites by expanding. So as the warmer waters move north and species may be moving north, there's these protected areas that the seabirds, the pinnipeds can move north as well. So it's looking at providing continuity of habitat within our region.
And actually, wasn't that the 4th point, kind of providing adequate habitat for
these correct.
Species?
That was the 4th point. Yes.
Excellent. So now what we're going to do is we're going to just give everyone a different perspective, the Mexican perspective on what's happening and how they're responding to this. We have Fernando Camacho Rico, who is the Climate Change Adaptation Strategies Coordinator at Mexico's Natural Protected Areas Commission, Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas. So we're going to have a video that we're going to play where he's going to explain what they've been doing working with the community there. And this is a great time to try to think of all the smart questions you want to ask, whether it's via Facebook or Twitter or here in the room itself. So we'll now turn to the video.
Antes que nada, me gustaría agradecerle a la CCA, la Comisión para la Cooperación de América del Norte, esta oportunidad para contarles un poco sobre el enfoque que tiene la institución en la que laboro para reducir la vulnerabilidad de los ecosistemas marinos y terrestres y de las comunidades humanas que habitan en ellos ante los impactos del cambio climático. Muy probablemente cuando pensamos en océanos y en mares, lo que nos puede venir a la mente es la belleza escénica y el placer que nos brindan. Pero aparte de eso, nos proveen de importantes servicios ecosistémicos, como que casi la mitad del oxígeno que se encuentra en la superficie terrestre proviene de fuentes oceánicas, o que del océano obtenemos importantes bienes de consumo y regula la temperatura de la superficie terrestre. Bueno, desgraciadamente los océanos también se han visto impactados por nuestras actividades de los últimos 200 años, como lo son modificaciones en la temperatura que tienen un efecto en las corrientes marinas y también un efecto en la intensidad y frecuencia de fenómenos meteorológicos como huracanes y otro tipo de fenómenos. ¿De qué forma podemos hacer frente a estos impactos? Pues bueno, a nivel internacional se ha identificado a la creación de redes de áreas marinas protegidas como una estrategia eficiente para reducir estos impactos. Las redes marinas protegidas no significan áreas de no extracción o de no uso de estos recursos naturales. No, lo que significa es hacer un uso sustentable de estos recursos para de esta forma permitir que se conserven los servicios ecosistémicos y sean menos vulnerables. Un ejemplo de los esfuerzos de redes de áreas marinas protegidas es la cooperativa de Isla Natividad. Esta cooperativa en el año 2006 decidió, junto con una organización de la sociedad civil llamada Conservación y Biodiversidad AC, destinar 2 zonas para la no extracción de recursos. Esto con el fin de mantener las poblaciones de abulón, que es la especie de la cual las comunidades de pescadores se mantienen. Desgraciadamente, en el año 2009 y 2010, en la península de Baja California, se presentaron eventos de anoxia. Esto es, reducción en las concentraciones de oxígeno en los cuerpos de agua. La anoxia produce, desafortunadamente, una reducción en las poblaciones de peces. Esto sucedió en la península de Baja California, en las zonas tanto de la Reserva de la Biosfera del Vizcaíno, en donde se tenía pesca, como en estos 2 sitios en los que se había seleccionado la no pesca. Afortunadamente, años posteriores a los eventos de anoxia, se documentó que en los sitios de no pesca, las poblaciones de abulón y de otras especies de peces se recuperaron de manera más rápida y más eficiente. Esto demuestra que los ecosistemas bien conservados son más resilientes, más resistentes ante los impactos adversos de fenómenos meteorológicos extremos.
Excellent. So now what I'd encourage is if folks in the room have any specific questions, they can line up by the microphone. And in the meantime, I will ask the questions that come in by social networks and continue to pepper Maria with questions myself. But we will start with Jérôme Spagyare of Quebec, who asked via Twitter, what would be, given your experience, the main features of a resilient MPA network, specifically in terms of surface area? So, you know, how big does it need to be? And maybe you can give a sense of, particularly given that there's so much activity on creating a network off the California coast, you know, what's the vision there, and how would you describe what needs to be done?
Well, there isn't a magic number in terms of how big a network needs to be, but there are factors that need to be considered when developing a network. And those factors are conductivity. If you want to make sure that the larvae can feed marine reserves, or feed the areas outside marine reserves. You want to see that you are able to protect the native biodiversity of the region, key species, and species of special concern, as well as key habitats and habitats of special concern. So those are the elements that you would like to, that you should look at when developing a network of marine reserves, especially in light of climate change.
And let's just drill down a little bit in terms of, for example, indicator species, since that's something that obviously the CEC has talked about as an important way of kind of measuring what's going on. It's something that you're looking at the Farallones. Could you describe a little bit about, you know, what, for example, again, maybe in the sanctuary, what are the best indicator species? Why are those the ones that you're looking at, and what can they tell us?
The indicator species we're looking at are ones that are critical to the food web, that if they were removed, we would see the food web reduce in size, or we would see potentially collapse the food web. In particular, in my region, one of the key species that the whole food web is dependent upon is krill. And it's the bottom of the food level. And so we invest in monitoring the krill population, trying to understand where the hot spots are for krill, because we have definitely been able to identify that there are hot spots. It's not widely distributed across the sanctuary, but there are particular areas where it seems to concentrate, and seeing what we can do in terms of marine zoning to protect those hot spots.
And actually, I mean, that might bring in a little bit of, I think it's also important, while again, we're generally focused in talking about ecosystems, you have the human component. And that's something that, of course, again, you deal with so much in the sanctuary, given that it's such an amazing part of the world that so many people recreate in, fish in, things like that. When you look at some of the changes, and when you mention zoning, of course, for example, I've covered in the United States national ocean policy and kind of the debate over quote-unquote ocean zoning, to what extent one should be clear about divvying up parts of the ocean the way that, frankly, we do on land. I'd just be interested if you could give us a sense of, when you're going through and making some of these changes and you're talking to the public, what's your sense of how people respond to some of the things you're doing? You know, what are the different constituency groups that you're often negotiating among? Could you give a sense of kind of the human element when you're working on these changes?
Sure. One thing that in particular for the region I manage is that we're off San Francisco, so we're near 8 million people. Our marine protected area is adjacent to. So there is that dynamic between development, people, and natural spaces. And one of the focuses of the Office of National Marine Sanctuary, the program which I'm under, is to engage in stakeholder involvement and really have the stakeholders be involved in the management of the sanctuary and public process. One of the ways in which we do that is we have sanctuary advisory councils, which are composed of members of the public and stakeholder groups. And they advise the sanctuary superintendent on the actions to take for that sanctuary. In particular, for my region, the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, one marine zoning activity we've recently been involved in that involved the local community. It also addressed climate change as well as protecting a critical habitat was eelgrass. We have eelgrass beds in one of our bays, Tamales Bay, and it's a healthy eelgrass population. However, eelgrass can easily be damaged and it's hard to restore. So we've put in no anchor zones, so a way of doing zonal management. So in the eelgrass beds, boats are not allowed to anchor. And actually, we're not allowing them to moor in eelgrass beds either. Through a marine spatial planning process, we've designed mooring zones where the boats can moor. They can boat anywhere in the bay. They just can't anchor and moor in the eelgrass beds. And this is to help maintain the healthy eelgrass populations. One thing, it was a community process, a stakeholder engagement process. We went to the stakeholders, developed a working group. They helped us design where the mooring zones would be, the activities that can occur. It was interesting, when we just recently took this plan to the public last fall, and the stakeholders that weren't engaged in the process didn't understand why we would be involved in a zoning process for a healthy habitat. It's healthy. Why do we need to do anything? So it's been an interesting process of educating the community why eelgrass is so important, as well as bringing them along to how they can help protect it.
And what do you tell them? And is the resistance coming from any specific segments of the population, or it's more a matter of the people who just weren't as directly involved in kind of the discussions you've been having?
It's, in particular, the resistance has come from people who are in the community, who live on the bay, who are very concerned that we're out there to stop all boating activities, and that boating is such an integral part of the culture there. And so it's basically having to reassure the community that no, we're not interested in ending boating, and working with them and their boating associations to to have a conversation, develop a relationship, and also to support their boating needs. So hearing them, what are their boating needs, and it's a win-win situation. They need facilities, sewage facilities, dump facilities, bathroom facilities. Not something that, you know, as a sanctuary, I don't really think I'd get involved in, but it's a way of engaging them and working with our partners to show that we're not ending boating, we care about boating, but at the same time, we care about the environment and that they can join us in protecting the environment. And one thing with eelgrass, relating it back to climate change, is that eelgrass is a carbon sink. It sequesters carbon. And it's one of those habitats we're looking at as, you know, for carbon sequestration. We're looking at eelgrass, salt marshes, kelp beds, and then in more tropical areas, mangrove forests. So it's a way of, you know, protecting the special habitat as well as a potential carbon sink.
And also, I was just wondering, since you're kind of mentioning again the projects I might associate with, say, a member of Congress working a deal on legislation, obviously, and this is something that I think that affects whether you're talking about the United States or Mexico or Canada, we're in an era of financial scarcity, that basically a manager like yourself doesn't have all the money in the world to spend on these. Can you give us a sense of, you know, how do you embark on some of these management changes when it's not as if you have unlimited resources at your disposal to do it? What are the best ways you found to either mobilize the resources or target your resources in order to get things done?
That's a great question, and it's a reason I hear a lot of my counterparts say that why they can't address climate change is because they don't have the resources. But I think it's a question, we don't have a choice. We have to address climate change. When I was asked, what's the greatest impact I see coming to the sanctuary? It's climate change. And that's why I've invested in dealing with it. And how I've done it without getting any extra money is by, one, partnerships. And we've just been able to build within the San Francisco Bay Area community amazing partnerships to deal with climate change. Our climate impacts report was done by bringing together we wanted it to be locally driven and develop local capacity. So it was all local researchers. At first we thought about bringing experts from around the country in to tell us about climate change. But then we thought, well, one, we're adding to the carbon footprint, and two, we're not building our local capacity. So bringing in those local research institutions, nonprofit NGOs that work on climate change, and other government employees, and they all donated their time to produce the document. And that's the same with the climate indicators. It's all been donated time from this group that we've developed a relationship with. And then in terms of addressing the solutions, we've done that in concert with the marine regulations, policies, and programs we were doing anyway. In order to protect habitat, which was the eelgrass, we also were protecting a carbon sink. The same with, right now, we're restoring wetlands habitat. And as we're restoring wetlands habitat, we're also developing more habitat that can be a potential carbon sink. So we couple it with existing activities we are already doing. In terms of education, we think education is key, that the public needs to understand that climate change is here, and it's happening now, and it's happening in their backyards. It's not just an Arctic issue. And by educating the public and putting that into our education programs, it's not a separate program. It's integrated into existing education programs. We're hoping to build a constituency that understands what we're facing and that can make decisions that are best for our marine environment.
Got it. We have a question via Twitter from George H. Leonard of the Ocean Conservancy, who is in Santa Cruz, and I'm quite confident he asked this question to prove to me that he's working today, because I often think he might be out on the beach, which he claims is part of his job. So his question that George asks is, how do you define resilience so you can test whether your strategies are making a difference against climate change?
That's a really good question, and actually one we're grappling with right now is how do you test resilience? And you know, I don't have the answer to that. All I can say is that we are having those discussions of what is resilience, how do you measure resilience? One of the things we're looking at is how quickly a population is able to respond back after a perturbation. If there is a extremely hot year in which we do see seabirds dying, how quickly are they able to bounce back? Are their populations able to come back? How quickly are intertidal areas that have had a really hot year and we've seen a die-off of intertidal organisms, how quickly does that ecosystem bounce back after that extremely hot year? And those are the things we want to make sure that they can, to the best of our ability, that those ecosystems, those species, those habitats can rebound after these extreme events.
Now we have our first Facebook question, which is from Amanda Lejbowish. Some species with bad indicators in the California part still show good health on the Baja California side. Do you think it could be possible to coordinate the effort with the Mexican MPA on both sides? And if yes, how could we do that?
Definitely. I think that we're going to have to address these issues trilaterally. We're going to need to look beyond our borders, both Mexico and to the north to Canada. Well, I guess we are in Canada. That we're going to need to look across boundaries to address these climate change issues, because the species, they don't stick to their marine protected area. Many of them, they migrate. We have birds that migrate that come to, for example, to the Gulf of Farallones to feed, but they nest up in Canada, up in the Arctic areas. We have the whales that calve in Mexico that come then to California to feed in the summer and fall months. So we do have to look transboundary. How do we do that? Well, one way we do that is through the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. They do bring together groups from scientists, MPA managers from the different countries to come together to develop guidelines for managers, to develop scientific publications. That's one way. Another is through developing relationships with MPAs that share species. I think that's where we start now, and in the future we may have to look at where we may begin sharing species that we aren't sharing right now. One of the things we've done to start moving down this path is we've looked at cetaceans that migrate between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and we started to put together a matrix of those species, what MPAs are involved in, and our next step is to start contacting the different MPA managers and talking about having sister MPA programs, action plans on how we can communicate what we're doing in our regions and build upon the different actions and learn from each other how we can protect these species.
So speaking of cetaceans, we have a question from Peter Owens of Toronto, Ontario, on Facebook. Acoustic pollution and habitat degradation, are those some of your other Farallones greater marine system stressors too, given that significant movements of animals using the Farallones and many other MPAs? Can you talk a little about what's happening with acoustic pollution right now, as well as potentially habitat degradation?
Acoustic pollution has, in recent years, has gotten more attention, particularly in our area. Through our Sanctuary Advisory Council process and through the public comment period, we received comments multiple times that we need to start looking at acoustic impacts. And quite frankly, I had very little knowledge of acoustic impacts and how to address them. So we put together a working group We had NGO representatives, we had scientists, and we had government agencies together to look at how can we address acoustic impacts. We know it's happening. There's concern that it's going to be more difficult for cetaceans to communicate with increased ocean acidification, and as well as the stratification within the ocean as ocean temperatures warm and there's more freshwater inputs from stronger storms, that we're going to see stratification within stronger stratification within the ocean, and it's going to inhibit communication. So what do we do about it? That's a really good question. What the recommendations that came out of our working group is One, we first need to establish what's the baseline of noise out there. And in order to establish that baseline, we need to have some monitoring occur. So looking at putting acoustic receivers within the ocean to determine that baseline. Then determine, is it increasing, the noise increasing? Is it maintaining? Is it decreasing? And then figuring out where is that noise coming from. And after we have that information, we'll be better able to address how to reduce the impacts.
Okay, and I can't let the superintendent of the Farallones Sanctuary be here without talking about sharks. But specifically, I will tie it to, of course, climate change, because there's an interesting paper that came out this past fall in Nature Climate Change about modeling species in the California current and how climate change is going to affect their habitat. And of course, sharks, with one exception, when they looked at 4 species, were among the biggest losers, that they were really the ones who were going to see their habitat hammered. And it raised kind of a question when, and there were a bunch of different researchers, including folks from Stanford and NOAA who worked on this, who raised the possibility of to what extent can you have mobile MPAs, that again, in this world of a changing climate, is it almost obsolete to talk about a fixed marine protected area, and to what extent do you need to have the flexibility and ability to really change it depending on these shifts. And again, as someone who has to oversee one and obviously knows what effort goes into crafting those boundaries, and in the case of the Farallones right now, modifying them, how realistic is that? To what extent can that be done? How crucial is it in terms of adapting to climate change?
I think we need to be open to all suggestions and look at, if they can work, and be creative. Climate change is going to make us be creative about our solutions. I think we're always going to need to have some stationary marine protected areas. One reason is that certain habitat is going to be valuable no matter what. For example, islands, offshore rocks, rocky reefs, pinnacles, those types of habitats are always going to be valuable habitat because it's going to support diversity. The diversity may change, but it's going to support diversity of wildlife, and it'll be a concentration point, a hot spot for wildlife. And so it's, in a sense, it's like a refuge within the ocean. For example, for birds or pinnipeds to haul out on. For the rocky reefs, it's shelter for fish. And it's also a substrate in which animals and invertebrates can hold on to in a sandy environment. So those areas are always going to be crucial or valuable habitat. In terms of the mobile marine protected areas, I find it very fascinating to consider. And I think there's some really good ideas behind it in terms of in terms of hotspots, there's these stationary hotspots, these rocky outcroppings, but there are also, as they say, these mobile hotspots that come with fronts and currents in which nutrients tend to congregate. And that will move and that will change. And I really like the idea of thinking about, is there a way in which we can have dynamic management and be flexible? It will be a new model for us. I think it's possible. It's definitely worth having the discussion.
And now we have a question from Jonathan Kelsey on Twitter. What role can MPAs play as places for research to understand climate change impacts on the marine environment? Can you talk about potentially either the research projects that are underway at the Farallones, or your sense of how these are laboratories for scientists to understand how global warming's impact?
Marine protected areas are excellent research laboratories for climate change. One, because oftentimes these marine protected areas have less influence than the areas outside, so you have a better control site. There tends to be a more focused research in that area. Marine protected areas are able to draw financial resources as well as equipment resources to the area. One of the things that we've been exploring within NOAA is having sentinel sites for climate change, and basically determining sites around the country in which we focus agency efforts on research on climate change in particular. And fortunately, the Gulf of the Farallones is part of one of these sentinel sites.
Great. From Snap Quebec, which is the provincial arm of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, on Twitter. What advice would you give in order to accelerate North American MPA networks and eventually reach Aichi objectives?
How do we advance the North American MPA network? A lot of it's going to have to happen from the ground up. I think decision makers, policy makers need to hear from communities and constituents that they want more marine protected areas. That's what I've seen has been effective in the area in which I live, because our expansion, which is a considerable expansion, that came from the community saying they wanted it in a time in which there aren't a lot of extra financial resources. It was the community saying, this is so important, it needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. And in order for decision makers to make these hard choices right now, they need to hear that their constituencies and the communities where they're located want them and that they're needed.
And speaking of kind of demands and questions, I think this would be a moment to hear what Brad DeYoung, who's a physical oceanographer at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, Canada, has on his mind. So if we can go to that video for a moment.
Good day, and thank you for this opportunity. As an oceanographer, I'm going to talk about regime shifts. These are sudden, dramatic, and persistent changes in ocean ecosystems that have been seen around the world. In Newfoundland, associated with the collapse of the northern cod, in the Black Sea linked to overfishing and pollution, and in the North Pacific tied to natural variability. Climate change, pollution, and fishing all stress the oceans, making these changes more frequent. We need new approaches to ocean management and science. I'm asking you, as ministers of 3 countries with strong bonds to the ocean, to support a marine ecosystem program for North American waters for the study and observation of regime shifts leading to improved ocean management. Our interconnected oceans need our joint action. Will you support such a program?
And now, this was a question that was being asked in the context of a meeting of the environmental ministers from Canada, the U.S., and Mexico last fall. But I think, obviously, Brad DeYoung is raising an interesting question, and the way I would put it to you is, what kind of appetite have you seen from the political establishment of these 3 countries, or, you know, again, if you're best versed in speaking of the United States, how much is there a willingness to take on this issue by political leaders here in North America? And what are you saying?
Well, in the last, I'm trying to think how many years, actually it's been a while, the last 3 administrations within the United States, we have seen an increased interest in ocean issues. There's been the National Ocean Policy. It's taken a long time to come out, but at least we're started. It wasn't on the agenda before oceans. So we've managed to get oceans on the agenda. Now I think that decision makers, they need to hear how important it is to raise the level of priority within administrations. It's there. So now we just need to raise the level of priority.
And when you, and certainly that's a sense I've gotten, when you look at, for example, the constituencies who you think are, for example, the most vocal in talking about what needs to be done about the oceans. Obviously, you know, a traditional one would be environmentalists who have raised this, or the academic community, the scientists who study it. When you look at maybe some of the less traditional communities that have been engaged in working, for example, to expand the Farallones, to, you know, and things like that, who would you say you're seeing on the ground is showing a more intense focus on the oceans and demanding some sort of action on these issues?
Well, it's interesting. Recently, in the last few years, someone who had traditionally been seen as against marine protected areas has spoken out in public hearings as an advocate for marine protection, and that's been the fishing community. We have partnered with the fishing community, one, to establish with the state the 7 special closures I mentioned earlier. It was the fishing community that came out and testified for them, and that was key in order for us to get them. And then now the sanctuary expansion we're seeing now, we had a public hearing just last week, and the fishing community came out and spoke at the public scoping, saying they wanted them, they needed to happen now. So that's a new partner for marine protected areas, is partnering with the commercial fishing industry. And I think they're seeing the value of them now. Some in some areas, in terms of when there are marine reserves and no fishing allowed, that it's actually, there's the spillover effect, that more fish are available, bigger fish are available. In terms of pollution control, having better water quality, protecting habitat from development. And a new stakeholder that we're going to be seeing, especially in terms of climate change, is going to be the non-traditional partners that we'll be working with, such as the public utility commissions and the departments of transportation. What we're looking at in the San Francisco Bay Area is using ecosystems to address sea level rise, erosion, to protecting infrastructure. So instead of putting up the seawalls and the riprap, building wetlands and restoration areas, that they're going to be more cost effective and more effective overall in addressing sea level rise and extreme storm events. So we're going to have new partners that we haven't had before for climate change. So it's going to be interesting.
So now Kim Wright of Living Ocean Society of Vancouver, British Columbia asks, I wonder, when designing MPAs, as we are doing in British Columbia, whether we need to be creating larger MPAs or adjusting the proximity of MPAs in the network to accommodate climate change specifically. Can you talk a little about this, particularly since it seems like Canada is taking a slightly different approach to doing MPAs, how when one's looking at it maybe in a slightly more coordinated fashion, would you maybe change how you would design an MPA?
Well, that's a great question, and one that relates to a guide that's being released today. It's a guide for managers of marine protected areas. How do you manage for resiliency in light of climate change? And within that guide, it outlines 4 steps in how to address current MPAs as well as expanding new MPAs. And the guidelines, the recommendations that have come out of that report include looking at our crucial species and habitats protected and species of special concern. Also looking at carbon sinks, our habitats that are viewed as carbon sinks, such as the eelgrass or seagrasses, kelp forests, salt marshes, mangroves. Are there adequate numbers of those habitats protected within the MPA network? And looking at creating MPAs to protect that habitat as a carbon sink. To look at connectivity. Is there enough MPAs? Are they close enough? Are they big enough in order to address connectivity between species? And then the 4th is looking at biodiversity. Are there MPAs large enough? Are there enough of them? Are they close enough together to fully capture native biodiversity within those MPAs? That you have a good representation and you have duplicacy, is that a word?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of those native species.
And so Alexandra Barron from the Canadian Parks and Wilderness in British Columbia asks, how can we accelerate the process of MPA establishment at the policy level? How long did it take to establish the Fairlawns Marine Protected Area? And so maybe if you could both talk about a little bit of essentially of the establishment, as well as how long it took to, for example, push for this expansion, and also this is not a process that's done. So what are you looking ahead at?
Okay, in terms of establishing the original sanctuary, Gulf Fairlawns, that was established in 1981, and I've been working there a long time, but not since the beginning. So I'm not quite sure how long it took to actually get it started. I knew it was a grassroots effort to get the original sanctuary protected. I can speak more to how long it's taking to get the expansion. In 2001, we received a petition from the community to expand the sanctuary. We said we'd look at it in terms of our management plan review process, which took 7 years. So it took 7 years to get it into our management plan, saying we would look at expanding the sanctuary, and we would look at it in the next 5 years. So that takes us to 2013. What really got us to start looking at expanding the sanctuary was overwhelming public cry for expanding the sanctuary to decision makers. The California congressional delegation came to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and to the President of the United States and said, we want this sanctuary expanded. And a couple months later, we sent out a notice saying we were beginning a public process to expand the sanctuary.
There you go. And again, we have a few more minutes left. I'm going to continue to take questions from social media, but anyone who wants to, sitting right here, can get up to that microphone and ask a question. But if not, we turn again to George Leonard, who is working doubly hard today, who asks, can we fully tackle climate change in the ocean without addressing carbon emissions?
No. Easy answer.
Right.
Simple. No, we have to tackle emissions because there's only so much carbon that the ocean can absorb. We have put more carbon into the ocean in the last, let's see if I can get the statistics right, but in the last 65 million years, I believe, than had previously been there. There's going to be a limit. It'll be saturated, in which no more carbon can be absorbed. And at that point, our ocean will be considerably different than what we know today. There's even some speculations that the oceans will no longer be blue, but will be purple, which would be.
Can you explain why would they be purple? What would cause?
Well, one would be, you know what, I can't explain why it would be purple. I just have recently seen articles in which that's the hypothesis that it'll turn purple. Okay, interesting. Yes, right.
And they're talking about right now doing the oceans are now, for example, 30% more acidic than they were in pre-industrial levels, and we're looking at a doubling of their acidity within the next several decades. Louise Blight on Facebook asks, politicians and other elements of society tend to think short-term, in other words, over election cycles. What sort of approaches are you taking to build support for measures that will work over ecologically meaningful timescales, in other words, decades or longer?
Yeah, that's where management comes into play. So if we can begin to build the changes in the way we do business, changes in policy into the management structure of these MPAs, that will outlast elected officials and changing administrations, because it's going to change the way in which we do business, which will be, it's much, the way we do business tends to stay in place a much longer period of time than a turnover of elected officials.
Got it. And now we have also through the audience via index card. Tell us about your observation on invasive alien species in the marine protected areas and how climate change could impact those species, both native and non-native species. So could you talk a little about that?
Yes. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, we have seen non-native species come into our area. As I mentioned, the Humboldt squid, bottlenose dolphins. People don't think of bottlenose dolphins as non-native. They are to the region in which I work. And we're also seeing non-native algae species coming into the area, also a tunicate. Some of these species will blanket habitat and make a monoculture, which we're very concerned about. And they come up with, one is called Undaria, and it is in warmer waters. And we're slowly seeing this species move into harbors up the coast. We're just recently seeing it in our southernmost harbor. And we're trying to eradicate it to the best of our ability. We really don't want to see it moving further up the coast because of that ability to create a monoculture and really reduce the diversity and impact the native species of the area. So I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that with climate change and with warming waters.
Evan Hoyd, former executive director of the CEC, who clearly continues to track his former colleagues, asked via Twitter, "We have dynamic management today, for example, short-term fishing openings, or closings, one might add. How can this grow to encompass dynamic protection of the working ocean?"
We do have dynamic management in terms of fisheries closures. The difference between, I think, between a dynamic management of fisheries closures and a mobile marine protected area is it would be expanding either the authorities of those fisheries management agencies to encompass more than fisheries management, to be more ecosystem based, to be looking at a broader range of species, or it's going to be expanding the authorities or the range of types of MPAs that MPA managers manage. MPA managers manage static locations, and it would incorporate more of the idea of dynamic areas. So it would change the way in which we do management.
Got it. And then one thing I was wondering, obviously we're talking about a lot of the kind of tough issues and choices that you face going forward. What makes you the most optimistic? I mean, obviously, you know, Fernando Camacho Rico talked about how there were these closed areas that actually, these no-take areas that showed the best resilience in responding to some climate impacts when it comes to abalone. When you look, you know, at the Gulf of Farallones, what have you seen that makes you think that this is something that you can respond to in an effective way?
Well, I think you have to respond with hope, because if you don't have hope, then what's the use of even trying? Let's just give up. And, you know, people can be amazing if they choose to be. If you look, when I was growing up, the big issue was the hole in the ozone and using aerosols, and it was going to destroy our environment. But we came together as an international community and we dealt with the issue. And that experience has stayed with me. And I believe that we can do the same with climate change. If we continue to have hope, if we can engage community and the public and really educate them about the issue. You know, I was a school kid and I became educated about the issue. If we can educate people about the issue, I believe that we can come together as an international community and that we can address climate change. And I have to have that hope because I have kids and I really want that ocean to be there for my kids.
Excellent, and I think we have one more question that we're going to take via social media, and then we're going to wrap up. So hold on one second. Patricia Schollenberg, USDA, Bryant and Stratton College, addressing sea level rise and extreme weather and reducing the devastating effects to major cities by restoring natural buffers and barriers. How does one accomplish this in New York City or a similar major city, which has rendered wetlands and natural barriers virtually obsolete? And then, while that sounds like a depressing question, we'll turn it around, since we don't want to end on a completely dark note, to say that really, certainly, for the United States, Superstorm Sandy was a moment that really made people think about the impacts of climate change and extreme weather, and really showed how natural barriers can sometimes work. What we saw, I know the Nature Conservancy that did some work restoring an area in Cape May found that that area did actually weather the storm better than other similar areas on the Jersey Shore. What's your sense about this discussion now about natural barriers and how, again, MPAs can play a role in really coping with impacts and ultimately fostering kind of a more robust ecosystem?
MPAs are generally located not along developed shorelines. Right. We have a greater opportunity within MPAs to restore shorelines, to create those natural buffers. I think we can serve, marine protected areas can serve as examples for the rest of the country or the countries, to the international community, that by protecting our natural areas, restoring our natural areas, and using natural areas as solutions, that we can then garner support to restoring areas that are developed. When there are catastrophes, when there are extreme weather events, that by showing in this MPA that we, for example, Cape May, that it was able to weather. If we have that opportunity to restore an area, using the natural solution. Also, looking at removing infrastructure when that infrastructure is obsolete and replacing it with restored habitat. That's something that's happening in the San Francisco Bay. It's not an MPA, but it is, I guess it's actually becoming what you could term an MPA. It's part of a national refuge now. It used to be salt ponds in which you know, they harvested salt, and now they're restoring I can't remember how many acres, but many, many acres into wetlands, and looking at how to restore it in a way that's going to protect the roadway that's inland, because underneath that roadway are the electrical lines, the sewage lines. So there's lots of infrastructure that's underneath the roadway. So when they're restoring, getting rid of infrastructure, restoring, they can also protect inland infrastructure at the same time, taking a long-term view, taking the 100-year view of where sea level might be.
Great. Well, I would hope everyone will join me in thanking Maria Brown for sharing her expertise, her knowledge, her insight, and her sense of hope. And she is going to conclude by showing off the publication. So I'll let you give your little plug for that. Okay.
Well, one thing I mentioned during the talk today for marine protected areas managers, and if we're looking at further building out our network, or see if the network is adequate, this guide can help us in doing that. It's the guide for planners and managers to design resilient marine protected area networks in a changing climate.
There you go. And it's got a cute turtle out front. So please join me in thanking Maria for sharing her thoughts with us today.